Hey folks, welcome to Plautus, the context, in which we'll be discussing bits and pieces of things that will help you make sense of the Roman comedy we'll be reading this week, Titus Machias Plautus's Pseudolus. So we'll start with historical context for Roman comedy. On we go. So let's talk first about the history of Roman comedy, because we're not jumping in here at the beginning, but rather the middle. Roman comedy is a mashup of influences from all over the Mediterranean. It's hybrid, much like Romans are, and they're taking bits and pieces from Greek language traditions and infusing it into existing Italian comic traditions. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a culture that doesn't have some kind of drama or staged activities. It's just a thing that human beings do as part of their storytelling culture. Plautus, however, is part of a movement that kicks off in Rome of the late 200s and high 100s BCE, bringing the best of Greek language drama into Latin language and culture. This is part of that larger moment that Cato the Elder is part of. Cato the Elder, among other things, is very attached to the idea of Romans should speak Latin, there should be Latin language literature, we shouldn't just all learn Greek and read Greek. And Plautus is, he's doing that. So here's what he's drawing from. And this is a little hard for us as historians to reconstruct because this is really early Latin literature. Plautus writes a little bit before Cato the Elder, actually. So he's going to be the oldest author that we read. Livy, he's writing about early Rome, but he's writing around the turn of the first centuries BCE and CE. So he's right there on the BC CE switch. Greek Old Comedy had been going for a while before it started to be written down and recorded. We only have one Greek comic who survives in full scripts, and that's a guy named Aristophanes. So Greek Old Comedy as a genre was all about taking contemporary political events and putting them on stage in a funny way. So they were a bit more like The Daily Show or news comedy. That's old comedy. But it's current politics with a fantasy element. So they'll be making fun of contemporary politicians, but also traveling to the civilization of the bird people, or going to the underworld to dig up a dead playwright to ask him questions about current events. So very absurdist, this kind of comedy. But not all of it is highbrow political commentary. It's also a lot of sex and fart jokes. So many sex and fart jokes. If you're familiar with the Lysistrata, it's the one you're most likely to have seen. It's this Greek old comedy where, to stop the Peloponnesian War, all of the women go on strike and won't have sex until the war is over, and it's pretty much wall-to-wall sex jokes, this thing. A little bit of fart jokes, and also sex/fart jokes. So it's this combination of highbrow and lowbrow that to us is a little bit jarring, but it really shouldn't be. We have comedies that are like this too. Perhaps this is a bit so. Okay, that's less dated. It's like The Dictator would be an example of this kind of comedy. The Borat oeuvre is kind of Greek old comedy. Team America World Police, if you're familiar with comedy shows of the early noughties, that's most definitely old comedy-esque. So we call this old comedy not because it's the oldest comedy ever, but because it comes before new comedy. So, new comedy gets kicked off in the next century. So this is 4th century comedy. They start moving away from political comedy because the political environment has gotten more unsafe. Aristophanes got sued a couple of times for the stuff in his plays. In new comedy, instead of, say, putting characters on the stage that are current politicians, instead they have these more domestic, middle and lower working class situations that still reference contemporary politics, just kind of in a less direct way. They're all about, though, universal themes, so they back away from gods and politicians and rich people, and they're more about daily relatable situations, TM. So this is a little bit more like Friends, or what was that show that, with Peter and the animated people, Family Guy, yeah. Yeah, it's stuff that's at least meant to be real life-ish. The Simpsons is another one that's more like new comedy. The sitcom genre, also romantic comedies, so pretty much anything with Drew Barrymore in it tends to be new comedy-ish. Even Ever After, which verges on old comedy. At any rate, the situations are domestic rather than political or encounters with the gods or mythological. So this is people living on a street having real-life situations. The conflict is family conflict based on stereotypes about ancient family structures. And in Italy, these were regularly performed by traveling acting companies who go from city to city to stage these. So this becomes a profession that's more like what we'd recognize as an acting profession. In the 5th century in Athens, you did have professional actors and professional playwrights, but it was very in-house in early years, Athenians putting this on for Athenian audiences. But as we get into new comedy, we start to have traveling actors who are bumping around the Mediterranean. And this means that comedy starts being less about Athens and more about Mediterranean communities writ large. In the very early years, so when Plautus is growing up, as Rome becomes more important, these traveling comedy companies start coming to Rome. In years before this, they wouldn't play in Rome. Rome is like a podunk city in every town USA, and you wouldn't get good money for it, you wouldn't get good tips. Also, the Romans are kind of intense. So you would have gone, say, to Etruria if you made it that far north, or Marseille, or you would have stayed in the cities of Magna Graecia in southern Italy. But when Rome gets bigger and has more money, it starts to attract these traveling shows. And it's likely in this context that Roman audiences got used to seeing this kind of new comedy play. That's the Greek half of the influence. But as I mentioned, Roman comedy is a hybrid of local Italian drama and Greek drama. So let's talk about the local Italian stuff. Italy had 3 major and probably more local traditions of comic acting. And these we know about from casual mentions in Roman literature. We don't have scripts for them in some cases because scripts aren't relevant. I'll explain what I mean by that. But they do get mentioned. They're related to different areas in Italy, and they're performance traditions that continue on undaunted as comedy like Plautus's writing becomes really popular. People are still performing these genres of comedy well into the Roman Empire. Italian farce is already a little bit like Greek drama in that the actors are wearing masks, and there are what we call stock characters. So there are these character archetypes that get reused from play to play to play. No matter what the play is about, you're going to see these same characters, often with the same names, so you can recognize them right off. We have this a little bit in our sitcom formats where there is the bumbling dad, the control freak mom, the whiny teenager. We have these stock characters that show up again and again in our comedy genres. The offensive boyfriend, the romantic girl who just wants a good guy and moves back to her hometown for Christmas to, you know, the Hallmark holiday film is just wall-to-wall stock characters. This doesn't mean it's not literature, it doesn't mean it's bad. This is a time-honored and long-running strategy for creating instant audience engagement. You see these characters and you're like, ah, yes, this is that stereotype. Awesome, I'm here, I know this person. It's shorthand. And it lets you move past the meet the characters part of your playwriting to go right for the situations that they get into that are funny. The ones from antiquity that we find out of Atellan Farce include a dude named Bucco, who was the fool. His name means cheeky, like chonky. The early roots of fat phobia do indeed come out of the ancient Mediterranean. There's this idea of the jolly, chonky idiot bouncing around, being hilarious. Like, I don't know, ancient John Candy, or, wow, that reference is aged. I'm sure you can think of people that are more relevant to you and your life. The other one, and this might seem a little bit redundant, but there's Machias. So Bucco is the guy who's funny because he doesn't get it, not because he's trying to be funny. So this is a stereotype that is as harmful as it is easy to recognize, because we still have these kind of fat-phobic concepts of like, big people are idiots, which is so offensive. So next up, Machias the clown is the guy who's funny, and interestingly, it's always a guy in ancient comedy, and that's still a bit of a problem with modern comedy, is the genderedness of funniness tropes. So Machias is the funny and he knows it character who's always trying to make other people look silly, the practical joker. This is, I don't know, the Ashton Kutcher, I can't say his name. Also, that's aged too. But at any rate, this is the practical joker dude who is often less funny than he thinks he is. There's also this dude named Paphos, another always male character archetype, and he is the silly old dude. So let's see, we've had fat phobia, we've been, let's see, normalizing toxic dude prank behavior. Let's go ageism for 3. Paphos is this out-of-touch old dude. This is the ancient version of the boomer. He doesn't understand the way the world is today. He doesn't like it. He complains about it. He thinks that young people are completely ruining everything, even though when he was a young person, he was that young person. So he's got this current of hypocrisy running down his general crankiness. So yeah, that's the kind of comedy flavor that we've got coming out of Atellan Farce. And this is all going to sound really familiar when we read Plautus, because Plautus uses this without a lot of edits. Atellan Farce, from what we can tell, revolved around slapstick, kind of Three Stooges, Tom and Jerry sort of stuff, where like people are hitting each other a lot and tripping each other and being randomly violent for kicks and laughs. It's not, as far as we can tell, particularly clever or high concept. It's very much, he fell over, that's funny, or haha, you farted. And again, that doesn't make that illegitimate comedy. I mean, people farting is funny. I don't know, maybe you don't think farting is funny, but I think it's funny. And I live with a 2-year-old, so I need all the levity I can get in my life right now. Okay, so that's Atellan Farce. It's very variety skit show kind of stuff. Mime is an interesting one because this continued to be really popular right on through into the empire. So this is a long-running, like almost 1,000 years worth of history to this, but we don't know a lot of it because mime wasn't scripted and it wasn't spoken. It was a lot more like a dance medium. So you were doing this all in gesture, and they're probably singing. Like, we think there are words, we just don't have the words from it. But it seems to, as the word mime implies, be based on a lot of like physical comedy, gesture, and singing was a big part of it. So the other interesting thing about mime is that, unlike Greek comedies, both old and new comedy, to a certain degree, like in the 4th and 5th centuries, this was a men-only kind of profession, so there were no women who were actors. Atell Farce similarly seems to have been a man actor only. If you have female characters, they're going to be men dressing as women to play the roles. Mime doesn't do that. Mime has an all-gender cast where, you know, you're dressing up and doing your parts. So this was an area where women could get into theater and often made, you know, huge reputations and long-standing careers. Pliny the Elder talks about this mime actor who lived to be, I think, 106, and still came out to do a show for the Emperor Augustus. She was the Betty White of ancient Rome. So she comes out of this mime and pantomime tradition. By the 200s BC, the 200s, 100s BC, the time of Plautus, other genres of comedy are beginning to have a small number of women acting with them too. They'd travel with these traveling shows and they'd be part of the stage. And this wasn't thought to be as objectionable in Rome as it was in mainland Greece. So one of the things we can give Romans props for is that, yeah, women on the stage were a thing. However, if you chose to go into professional acting and were a woman, you would be treated as a sex worker. Romans equated that with prostitution, and your testimony wouldn't be admissible in a court of law, and you would be discriminated against in various other legal ways too. So, excuse me, it wasn't a win-win sunshine and rainbows kind of situation. But if you didn't mind the official hate and snobbery, you could have a great career doing this. And a certain number of women in acting got to be really famous, really high-paid, well-respected artists. So yay, cool. Mime itself was what we call bawdy, and if you're not familiar with this old-timey English word, this means lots of sex humor. And a lot of like physical sex humor. Mime costumes seem to involve a lot of enlarged stuffed genitals that you're waving at people for comic effect. It's not a particularly subtle kind of sexy humor. And striptease as part of the dance seems to have been involved too. So this is a little bit like musical theater, a little bit like exotic dancing. There's some slippage in that area. And you know, we're still negotiating this boundary, right, with the degree to which we treat pole dancing like it is a legitimate kind of dance. Frankly, it is. It requires skill. You have to learn how to do it. I don't know how you don't chap your thighs doing that. Like, so much mad respect. It's really cool. But as a culture, we tend to sexualize and objectify it for reasons that are cultural. Similarly with mime, there was this tendency to sexualize mime actors and mime performances. Pantomime, like the name suggests, seems to have spun off of mime, and this was dance without song. So this was completely dance-based. So this is more like ballet. So if mime is a bit like musical theater, pantomime is Swan Lake. And this was another area that we also see women engaging in and performing in. So this could have been your ancient stage profession, and you could have gotten super duper famous and ended up in Pliny the Elder, which is really a life goal for me, if not for anyone else. So all of these things come together to make Plautus. And Plautus is at the perfect time for this. He's writing during the Second Punic War into the Third Punic War, at this time where Rome is just taking off as an international superpower, where all of these people are coming into the city of Rome because they've been enslaved as prisoners of war. So this isn't a happy story, but it is the situation. One of the upshots of this is that Rome gets suddenly very cosmopolitan, and it's not a coincidence that Plautus and his colleague Menander, the two surviving Roman playwrights, arise out of this environment where Rome is suddenly being exposed to all these new cultures and all these new ways of entertaining yourself, and they can finally afford to go do it. Yay! So why do we have Plautus? How did this survive? And this is a question that's important to ask of any ancient text, because we have a very small percentage of surviving literature from the past. We only have two Roman comic playwrights. We have Plautus, and we have a teeny tiny little bit of Menander, is that right? No, sorry, Menander's the Greek guy. Terence. We're not reading Terence, we're reading Plautus, but there is much less Terence. We have a lot of Plautus, not because there are a lot of copies of Plautus, but because of one copy. That's it. We are now looking at the copy, the manuscript. That's the only reason why we have this play. And talking about this manuscript helps illustrate why it is so difficult to get entertainment from the past. Because this wasn't considered highbrow. There weren't people copying this like they were philosophy or rhetoric or history, or even farming facts. Like Cato the Elder we have because that was considered really useful farming advice. It was a manual that you could use to make your farm. Plautus is just going to make you laugh. He's not going to teach you anything practical. So he's not somebody whose works were copied as much as other people's were. Then as now, people thought of entertainment as this cool extra and not an essential thing that we need to remain sane in a messed up world. Hopefully we'll come out of this pandemic thinking a little bit better of our writers and entertainment producers, because gosh darn, can you imagine going through this without Netflix? Okay, so this is the Ambrosian Palimpsest is the name of this text. And palimpsest needs a little bit of explanation. A palimpsest is something that we used to do back when books meant for longevity were written on parchment. So often you'll hear people use parchment as a synonym for paper, like an old-timey word for wood pulp paper. That's not what parchment is. Parchment is made from animal skin, very thin animal skin that's been prepared in a way that makes it a sheet that you can write on. But because it's actually leather, it's much more durable. It maintains its flexibility longer than paper does. It doesn't break down in the way wood pulp breaks down. And it's also a little bit thicker. It's got layers because it's made out of skin. And you can scrape off the top layer and still have a usable writing surface. So it's erasable and recyclable, and that's where palimpsests come in. Now we're in a medieval monastery, right? So put your head in medieval monk space for a minute. Okay, your old copy of St. Augustine's City of God is wearing out. You need to make a new copy, but you can't afford the massive amount of money it takes to make more parchment. To make an ancient or a medieval book out of parchment, you had to kill more than a single herd of sheep to get enough skin to make the book. And because it was made out of leather, there were parasites that would come in and eat it, so you had to take really good care of the parchment and treat it with certain chemicals. It was expensive to make the parchment, much more expensive than it is to grind up wood and make wood pulp paper, which did exist in the Middle Ages. It's just not as durable. So instead of buying a bunch of new skin, what you would do is you'd take an old manuscript that you weren't using anymore. So in the same way that we occasionally go through our own physical libraries and we sell off or throw out books that we're not using, old periodicals, stuff that's been digitized. And they take sandpaper and razor blades to the surface, and they rub off the layer of ink on the top and then right below. And that's called a palimpsest. And you're looking right now at a middle page of the Ambrosian Palimpsest. In fact, this is a page with a little bit of the play we're reading now, the Pseudolus. And if you look very closely, so you'll see that there's this tiny, tiny handwriting. Get my red pen. So tiny, tiny handwriting in rows here. And then you've got this big handwriting that's kind of washed out like a watermark. The big handwriting is what was erased off of the parchment, and the little handwriting is what was copied on there instead. So they took this deluxe edition of the complete works of Plautus from A to Z. So it's the plays arranged from the A's to the Z's in a big, anniversary collection volume with nice big capital letters, which is why they're these giant all caps thing. Non-capital letters hadn't been invented yet, so when ancient Romans write, they're in caps lock all the time, which I find hilarious. It's like they're shouting, and you've met the Romans. They're really intense. So on this page, you can see the erased letters really well, because what seems to have happened is some days the monks doing the erasing were really into it, and they erased the letters really well, so we can't see all of the bits. So even in the Pseudolus, occasionally we'll be missing a word or two, and the text will leave a blank there where we're missing words. So on the days where the erasing was going really well, we can't see the words. We've lost that page because it was erased too well. But this monk, this was a lazy monk. And this was a lazy monk who, every time it got to be around like lunchtime or something, started going faster so he could get to the end sooner so he could go eat lunch. And thank goodness for this procrastinating lazy pants monk, because he was so lazy that we can still see the erased letters. And this means that we get two for the price of one. We have St. Augustine's City of God on the top, which is yay, that's nice. Like 4th century African church fathers are wonderful literature. You go, St. Augustine. But below it, we have Plautus's plays written in these capitals, so we can read both. And that's why you have this week's reading. It's a translation of this exact manuscript that you're looking at right now. And if Lazy Monk wasn't lazy, we wouldn't have it at all. So let's take a moment to be thankful for Lazy Slacker Monk. Thank you, Lazy Slacker Monk. We appreciate you. So the next time you're feeling like a lazy slacker, keep in mind, sometimes lazy slackers are really, really good for the greater good. So, maybe the problem isn't you. But yes, on some days, Lazy Monk was, his supervisor was there. He had enough coffee, and of course he didn't. He might have had coffee depending on how close he was to Arab trade routes. When he was on his game, we're missing big bits. So we only have fragments of Plautus's plays. But somewhere around the P's, that was where the lazy monk was at his laziest. And it's right in the middle of the book, so that's the place it would make sense to get lazy. So the Pseudolus, right there in the middle, we have most of it. So we're reading the most complete surviving play from this manuscript. So let's talk about staging. Ancient plays could be performed anywhere. A really fancy city would have a permanent theater, and they started to pop up in the 4th century as new comedy got going. But there was a standard stage layout that plays from the ancient world are built around. When you didn't have a stone theater, you'd have people sitting on a hillside, or you'd build wooden bleachers and a wooden set, and then you'd take it down when the festival was over. Plays were frequently performed in the context of religious festivals, especially those sacred to Dionysus, the god of wine and theater, entertainment. Oh, Dionysus. You would have important people sitting in the front here, and the less important you were, the cheaper your seat up here in the back. And on the stage itself, there would be 3 doorways, so one in the middle and then one on either side that were the entrances and exits that the characters would go in and out of. Really fancy theaters, like the one we're looking at here on the right, had these playhouses built in permanently in stone, and then you just paint it with whatever you needed in terms of sets. But some just had pillars for the substage, and then you'd make everything else out of wood, maybe with a little bit of stonework to buttress it, and then you could build your set to look like whatever you needed it to look like, or you'd be traveling around with your set and you just set it up on the purpose-built stage. In the city of Rome, there wasn't a permanent stone theater until the 1st century BCE, when the general Pompey the Great built the first theater in downtown Rome. And it was a space that was used both for drama and also for meetings of the Senate, including, well, the big day coming up this weekend, March 15th, the Ides of March, in which Julius Caesar was stabbity-stabbed to death in 44 BCE in the theater of Pompey, because the Senate house was falling down, so they were meeting in the theater instead, as you do. Okay, so the big take-home point for this is that there are 3 doors. Special effects include things like cranes that could lower people, mostly people playing gods. So if you had a god come in the middle of the play, you'd lower them from the top of the set, and then they'd fly down, land on the stage, and then they'd be cranked up and leave again, which gives us the Latin phrase Deus Ex Machina, which means a god coming out of a machine, or a god lowered on a crane, which is theater speak for a lazy solution to a plot. So if you can't figure out how to end your story, so you just have a god show up and say, like, okay, you do this, you do that, you two, you're married now, bye-bye. It's considered lazy writing, but it's considered lazy writing because a lot of ancient playwrights do it. And I don't think it's always lazy. I kind of enjoy it, but I like corny things. Actors, as I mentioned, were mostly men for plays like Plautus. So Plautus, because he's pulling on the Greek tradition, is writing for likely an all-male group of actors. But as time goes on, comic plays begin to include women actors. And for local Italian traditions, that's a thing that's always been there. I have a colleague who works on the history of women in theater in the ancient world, and by the time we get into the Roman imperial period, you have a lot more women participating in more kinds of theater. But for the most part, we have men wearing outfits, often padded, so you'd have like a padded under outfit, and then you'd have your costume and then a big mask, so that you'd look bigger and be easier to see from back in the back of the theater. You'd be wearing a mask that would have your character type on it, but also these little face expression things that some people think may have included a little megaphone structure so that you could be heard a bit better. So you're not acting with your face in most of these forms of play, and certainly in Plautus, you'd be wearing a mask. So all of your acting is going to come through your gestures, your body positioning, your timing, your voice. And that wasn't thought to be unsettling or anything. That was thought to be a feature, not a bug. But this meant if you were a professional actor, you're going to be focused a lot more on your body as instrument rather than your face as instrument. And a lot of the humor is going to come through your vocal tone and timing. These are a couple of scenes of actors acting in plays from different ancient art. This relief sculpture, the paint has come off, but you can see people in their costumes with their draped Greek-style clothing. None of the things they're wearing here are togas. A toga has a curved edge to the drapery, and these are all square, so they're dressed like Greek people. And that's part of how Plautus gets away with this drama, is all of his characters are Greek people. So we're not laughing at Romans. We're, oh, ha, there's funny Greek people in their funny Greek situations. It lets Plautus put a little bit of space between the play and the audience so he can get away with more social commentary, which is fun. In this particular troupe, the actors look to be male-bodied people dressed up as female characters. So this character here likely is, uh, we can tell from the longer-ish hair, sort of, and the drapery that this might be a female character, but again, it's hard to tell. And the actor dancer has a pair of little castanet things in their hand, which suggests that this is from a mime performance or a pantomime where there's dancing going on. The musical instrument here, the aulos being played in the background, is a very loud musical instrument, and it would be difficult for, I mean, you could sing to an aulos accompaniment, you just have to be very loud because it's like a really bratty oboe kind of sounding thing. It's so loud that this was used to keep soldiers in time when they were marching in war. So we're talking really loud, like trumpet loud. So this is probably a mime or pantomime show. And you can see one of the 3 doors in the set here in the back, but then also they've got a curtain pulled up here for some of the set dressing. And then this scene, so this is from a Roman mosaic, and we can tell this is a theater scene because everybody's wearing masks, including this character who's in a mask with gray hair. So this is an old character, and since the cloak's pulled over the head and the other 2 characters have female hairdos, these are probably female characters sitting around having a scene, as you do. So a few more costume ideas. These are a close-up of 2 theatrical masks from mosaics in Pompeii. You see these together a lot, a comic one and a tragic one. So this one's wearing a grape cluster headdress, which means it's associated with Dionysus. And this is why we know that the masks have these wide open mouths on them, also from art like the art we were looking at earlier. But not every play would have included masks. For instance, this stage scene, and we know it's a stage scene because the people aren't dressed like people on the street would be. They're wearing these closely fitted pants underneath their tunics with these dangly apparatuses. So this is a stuffed fake phallus that was part of your comic getup because that was funny to ancient people. In the same way that, oh, I don't know, when you pull off Sylvester Tweedy's pants, cartoon pants, they're always wearing little boxer shorts with red hearts on them. So instead of boxer shorts with red hearts, the ancient world would have a particularly large phallus. Body norms at the time believed that a small phallus was a pretty phallus and that a big phallus was an ugly phallus, because that's the body shaming norm and the unrealistic body expectation. Large phalluses were associated with foreigners or with people who had self-control issues. Like a lot of body shaming narratives, this gets pretty toxic pretty fast. But because this is comedy, part of the funniness would be like, ha ha, look at them, their bits are hanging out. That was thought to be funny because it's embarrassing, which is a thing in humor. One of the things that humans consistently find funny are things that we find anxiety provoking. For instance, being able to recognize somebody in embarrassing, cringy situations that we ourselves have been in can be funny. It can help us to laugh at the times we've done the thing because that person is doing the stupid thing too. So, okay, it's more normalized. It's not just me. So it can be that laugh of relief recognition, but it can also be a laugh of, oh my gosh, I would never do that, that idiot. And it all depends on the eye of the audience. So this is a murky area of humor studies. And there are people whose entire life is in the theory of humor and why funny is funny. A surprisingly unfunny area of study. In part because a lot of the things we laugh at are the same things that are deeply traumatizing. Because this is a consistent human way for dealing with trauma, yes, but also laughter can be either affirming and humanizing or it can be derisive and divisive, depending in some theories on which direction you're punching in. So there's the punch up, punch down theory, where if you are making fun of more powerful people who are normally afforded respect in your society, then your humor is creating a more equal playing field. It's pointing out hypocrisy. It's creating a place where people without power can have a voice. But if you punch down, if you're making fun of people that you're also oppressing, like, say, enslaved people, or in the ancient world, women, immigrants, then you are punching down. You're beating up on people who are already stigmatized in your society as a way of othering them, as a way of creating in-group solidarity with elites. So you're saying, like, ha ha, other elites, aren't foreigners funny? And they're like, yes, yes, they're so funny with their foreign ways. And then we all bond over cigars or whatever it is that we are doing as elites. And we go on our merry way, continuing to oppress people with a clear conscience because, haha, isn't their pain funny? And that's punch up, punch down theory. And depending on who you are in Plautus's audience and who Plautus is and who the actors are, there is both going on. And that's one way you can read this, is thinking, okay, is this a punch up? Is this a punch down? What is Plautus trying to say here? And is he saying many things to many different audience members? It's not the only way things can be funny, but it's a good lens to keep in your toolkit. Alrighty. And that's what I wanted to say about that. Another scene. This one, though, is a backstage scene, and we can tell because this actor has his mask off. That's not a severed head, that's a mask. And interestingly, it's an actual old actor playing an old dude. I wonder what that was like for him. And then there's this guy in the background. He's getting into his costume tunic, his oversized costume tunic. And then there are these guys who don't have their costume tunics on yet. They just have their stuffed undergarments on with what is probably goat skin with the fur left on so that it bulks up their costumes. You'll notice this actor here, their costume is super big around their hips. That's likely because of the wool they're wearing underneath their outfit. And here up top, they're wearing a wreath, so they're already in costume, kind of warming up their aloes. Yeah, it's just a neat scene. Really nice backstage, too. They can afford columns. Spiffy. On to Plautus himself. Everything we know about this guy is conjecture based on much later biographers. He, according to tradition, and again, we can't prove this, which is why I'm being very cautious about how I phrase this, Plautus was allegedly born in Umbria. This is central Italy, so back up in the Apennine Mountains, away from the city of Rome. And it's a bit telling, even if this isn't the real story of the real Plautus, the fact that biographers were like, oh yeah, he's not from the city of Rome, he came to Rome from elsewhere. So that is a meaningful thing to believe about this very important figure. And he lived from about 254 BCE, we're really not sure about this, to 184 estimated death date, and that's because that's the latest datable thing we can find in his plays. And because his plays do reference current events, that we can pin down a little bit better. So he dies well before the Second Punic War and 146 BCE. So he's actively writing during Hannibal's invasion of Italy into the post-Second Punic War years, so that moment. This is also the period when Cato the Elder is coming to power. Cato the Elder writes a little bit after Plautus. And it's possibly Plautus that's part of what Cato the Elder hates so much about Romans these days. His name Titus Machias Plautus raises some eyebrows in ancient studies scholars because there are elements to it that makes us doubt whether this is a real Roman name, even though it looks like a real Roman name, right? Titus. Titus is a Roman dude's name. It's got three parts. There's a praenomen, a cognomen, and like just the nomen in the middle. However, Titus is a little bit like the English nickname Dick for Richard, or Peter sometimes is used as slang for a certain person's body part, or well, roughly 50% of people's body parts. I'm not going to say which one. I'm sure that you can extrapolate. It's a private one. Anyway. Oh, right. I have it on the slide. There you go. It's slang for phallus. So even though, yeah, there were real Romans named Titus, in the same way that there are real Americans named Dick or Peter, possibly a lot of you guys. Also, my husband's urologist, which is Peter Dickman. It's just the best urologist name. Like, you're either going to have to be a urologist or you're going to have to change your name if your parents do that to you. He's a great guy. I love him. At any rate, so this could be somebody's real name, but the other parts of this name lead us to think that perhaps, just perhaps, this is his pen name. If you're not familiar, a pen name is a fake name that you write under, like, the lady who wrote Twilight, whose name I'm not remembering at the moment. Is Stephanie Meyer her real name? Oh gosh, that's a horrible example. George Eliot, that's a pen name. Some people think Shakespeare might be a pen name, some people don't. I'm not going to weigh in on that. Machias, you may recall from the last slide, Maccus is the stock character name for the clown in Atellin Farce. Machias is, with the IUS, implies like son of the clown. Ooh, and it's not a Roman nomen we have attested elsewhere. Like, most Roman nomina are big family names. There are tons of Tulliuses or Juliuses running around Rome. Machias, no, that's not really a thing, except for that clown stock character dude. The last name Plautus is a word for a flat foot, somebody with a fallen arch. Romans thought that feet were hilarious. There's a lot of foot humor. Also, there seems to be a lot of foot fetishy things going on in ancient Rome, and also there are a lot of body standards around feet. If you had a flat foot, that was thought to be funny because that was an ugly foot, but if you have a nice high arch, then, oh, you've got a pretty foot. And there was all kinds of body norming and eyeballing. Also ankles, really into ankles, Romans. And because mime was associated with flat foot dancing, there seems to have been some like stomping going on in mime dance figures, maybe even like clogging. All of these put together, you've got a comic author writing Roman takes on Greek comedy, going by a name that's essentially Dick Bozo Slapstick. Dick Bozo Slapstick may sound like an American name in that it's got a beginning, a middle name, and a last name, but if you say that name, like if you meet somebody named that and you're in middle school, you're not going to react in a very mature way to it. That's what raises our eyebrows about Titus Machias Plautus, because that is a really funny name for a Roman's mom to give him. Probably Plautus's mom didn't name him this. More likely, this was a name that he put together so that he could sign his plays and nobody would know who he was. And this has led people in the ancient world and modern world to wonder, okay, so what was this guy's deal? Ancient people thought that he was either a lower class person, an immigrant, an enslaved person, or a formerly enslaved person. And that is an interesting thought for us modern folk, because a lot of the humor in Plautus is grappling directly with funny situations involving slavery, which doesn't sound like an immediate, oh, haha, funny. There's a theory of comedy that we use comedy in part to cope with traumas that are too difficult to deal with directly. So by laughing at them, we're able to dispel tension in a way that lets us grapple with these things that are actually very distressing. And Plautus, as you'll notice, does lean into the trauma of enslavement a lot. And his main character is almost always an enslaved person who is sticking it to the man, which led ancient people to say, like, well, obviously a slave wrote this. However, there are reasons that kind of oversells the wokeness of Plautus a bit. By the end of the play, things tend to go back the way they were at the beginning, so there are some limits to this. It's also possible that he was a Greek-speaking immigrant who's translating Greek plays for a Roman audience. A lot of the plays we can find Greek new comedy that's very similar to Plautus's Latin version, so there does seem to be some direct translating going on as well as adaptation for a Roman audience. So a story where he's from one of the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia, or he's from elsewhere in the Mediterranean, moves to Rome and starts translating, that's also a scenario, and a scenario that still makes him an outsider. He's an immigrant, a Greek speaker, in an environment where Greek-speaking people are being enslaved en masse and sold off to Romans for their intellectual labor. So these aren't two different stories. Both of these can be true. He is an unwilling immigrant who is being enslaved and trafficked and then somehow gets into playwriting. All of this is possible. Or he could be an upper-class Roman who speaks Greek, as many upper-class Romans did. At this period, you would commonly be sent to study abroad in a Greek-speaking area, and then you would come back to Rome to go into politics. This is what Cato the Elder did. Cato the Elder, who hated Greeks more than like anyone else, had been sent off to college in Athens and spoke Greek really well. Very familiar with Greek science, too. So all of these could be possible. Without a time machine, we're never going to really solve this for sure. But it's an interesting thing to sit with as we read Plautus. We could be looking at literature created by someone with experience of enslavement and human trafficking from the enslaved person's point of view. But we've also got somebody whose audience and backers, the people paying for the plays, are the same people doing the trafficking and enslaving. So he's got to talk to multiple audiences at the same time. And it's interesting as you're reading this play to think about, okay, if I were in the audience and I were enslaved, how would I feel about this joke? If I were an enslaver, how would this make me feel uncomfortable? Would this make me feel insecure? Like, how would I react to this humor? All of this is one of the reasons why this is a great time to sit with this play and experience it now that you've met the Romans and you have an idea of who's in the audience. This is something that they found really funny. So why? It's partially why we're doing this. On to our stock characters for ancient Rome. And this is something that you can use as a bingo card when you're reading the Pseudolus, because yeah, I think all of these characters are in the Pseudolus. So this is taken likely from a combination of Italian farce and Greek New Comedy. And these character types seem to transcend boundaries of language in the Mediterranean well before Plautus. The first one, and almost always Plautus's main character. In the Pseudolus, this is definitely the main character. The play is named Pseudolus after the character Pseudolus, who is the clever slave archetype. I'm using the quotation marks here, the air quotes, because clever slave is the character name. It's not just something I'm projecting on here. The stereotype for a clever slave is that this is a really smart person who is gaming the system to their advantage. And I'm trying to think of an example of a clever slave who isn't male. I think they're all male characters that I can think of off the top of my head. And they're all about manipulating their enslavers and their community in the service of their own agenda. And this has all kinds of layers to the stereotype because it's hitting right on one of the major anxieties that someone who is an enslaver in the society is going to feel. Because you own a lot of human beings, and they're still human beings, right? They are intelligent. They have their own agendas. They don't like being oppressed. They are going to not always be happy that you are enslaving them. And they are, in fact, going to try to get out of being enslaved by you. So something you're continually worrying about if you happen to be a Roman who owns other human beings is you're going to be worried about whether the people whose labor you are currently exploiting are going to harm you. They're going to use the access you give them to your household to mess with your household. They're going to undermine your financial bottom line. They're going to mess with your kid, all kinds of very real worries that I don't have a lot of sympathy with because, more power to anybody who is getting you back for this. But part of where this anxiety is coming from for Romans is that they do realize that enslaving somebody is not a good thing. And at its base, it is kind of abusive, and that a natural human reaction to being trafficked and exploited is to want to get out of that. In fact, the system relies on enslaved people wanting to get out of it through the legitimate, again, in scare quotes here, the legal methods that Romans create. So part of how Romans went about incentivizing people to cooperate as enslaved members of society was by giving them the promise of freedom that came with some responsibilities to help you succeed as a free person. And with that, we'll get into that a bit more when we talk about patronage next unit. And this was a bit of a safety valve in the system. And a lot of people, for various reasons, and none of which we should ever judge somebody for, by the way, there is no right or wrong way to be enslaved or exploited. It's all equally bad, and whatever you do to survive, I have no problem with. But for a lot of people, the risks of rebelling were significant. If Romans caught you at it, they would regularly kill not just you, but everybody who is in your household with you, whether they approved and helped you or not. The assumption was that if you don't inform on your enslaved colleagues, then you are as equally guilty of rebellion as the ringleaders, and therefore you all need to be killed and punished with extreme prejudice. This isn't just kill you, this is kill you with torture. So crucifixion was the go-to method for killing. We'll talk more about crucifixion later. It is a very horrible way to kill someone, like so messed up that it legit upsets me. I kind of have to steel myself to talk about it. It's that bad. Makes Easter really fun as a Christian, by the way. Yeah, so crucifixion, really bad, but also like feeding people to wild animals, like burning a lot, like all kinds of really horrible death methods that were perfectly legal, right? When you owned somebody, you could do whatever to them because you own their body. It's your property, again, scare quotes. So this very real anxiety on both sides, right? If you're enslaved, you're constantly worried, oh God, are they going to think that I'm rebelling and kill me horribly? If you enslave someone, you're going to be constantly worried, like, oh God, are they going to rebel? This is not a healthy relationship dynamic. This leads to a lot of anxiety. And theorists who look at Plautus see that anxiety being acted out. One of the things that Plautus's plays do is that the main character is almost always an enslaved person who is manipulating their enslavers for an agenda, but it all turns out okay. It's fine. It's funny. We can laugh at it, and then we can kind of um, bleed off some of our anxiety and then go back to our lives, which is also something that is a little bit haunting to me when I think about Plautus's comedy. Like, on the one hand, it's being really real about showing why slavery is a messed up institution, but its humor is in the service of maintaining the status quo. You laugh at it and therefore don't take it seriously, and therefore you go on oppressing people. But this is a problem with comedy in general. Comedy can be a great vehicle for exposing problematic stuff in society. It's a wonderful way to change hearts and minds and get them to realize that cultural dynamics are messed up. But it can also be a way of normalizing things that we don't want to normalize, and that's a very thin line to walk. So that's what I have to say about clever slave archetype. And this clever slave often has foils, singular but mostly plural, of the, and here major scare quotes, the good slave, by which we mean good as defined by Roman elite enslavers. So this is, I think cooperative slave might be a better word for it, but that's not the word that's currently used in history of theater studies about this. So this is a slave, an enslaved character who has gone all in, has, if you'll pardon me borrowing a rather objectionable cult term, this is an enslaved person who has drunk the Kool-Aid. They've bought into the system. They are fully invested in sublimating their own agency for the agency of their enslaver, and are trying their best to cooperate with the system. And again, I'm not judging. This does seem to be a common coping mechanism that we find in real life Romans. But in Roman comedy, this is often a character who's there as a foil to the clever slave as they're plotting, and this is the character who's like, oh no, you shouldn't do that, that's bad. And this is a person who's easy to manipulate because they kind of have given up in a sense. And a lot of the comedy comes from, oh my gosh, get a load of this guy. It's one of the weird catch-22s of Roman slavery, is that the clever slave, the enslaved person who knows they're being exploited and is trying to undermine the system from within, is stigmatized but also admired for the cleverness. But then enslaved characters who drink the Kool-Aid are made fun of for not getting, like, cheese. This is one of these things that it's funny, but also it really bothers me. And that's okay. It is okay to be bothered by things that you meet through humor. In fact, that's one of the things humor does, is it helps us learn how to notice stuff that we wouldn't normally notice, especially if we're privileged, which brings us to my next category. So, lusty, miserly old men. Also just the old man stereotype. I mentioned him earlier. This is a thing from Atellin Farce. It's in Greek Old Comedy too. So this is an old guy who in his youth was an idiot who wasted a bunch of money and was, oversexed and problematic, but he's bought into the system. He's a grown-up now, dang it, and he cares about grown-up things and dignity, and he wants his kid to behave, but his kid won't behave, and but he's also super resentful of being grown up. Like, one of the frequent patterns here is that the old dude and his son are both going after the same woman. Ugh. We'll get into that in a minute. But his main concern is his money, hence the miserly thing. So he's lusty, right? He wants to get with age-inappropriate young ladies. Ugh. And he also is really cheap. mainly because his kid's wasting a bunch of money, but also like he doesn't want to pay for stuff, and he's constantly complaining about how everything's too expensive and he's got a mortgage and so on and so forth. And that's meant to be funny, but it is an ageist stereotype too. This idea that old people are hypocritical and they don't want to learn and they're just tight with their like that's it's a relatable stereotype that's still in our comedy, but that doesn't make it okay either. Old people are people. People are people, and yeah, it's stereotype humor is more and more questionable the more and more you think about it. Now, similarly, the other side of this coin is the privileged son. This is either the only or oldest son in a family, and he is the younger version of the old man. So like the old man, he also really wants to be in a relationship, usually with an inappropriate young lady, and that's the central plot in this play. So the young kid is in love with the sex worker next door, and he really wants to purchase her so they can be together. And his father thinks that's a waste of money and that he should get married like a respectable young man, but oh, the father thinks she's hot too. Oh gosh. But the privileged young son doesn't get how privileged he is. Like, he spends most of the play, the Pseudolus, whining to his enslaved buddy Pseudolus about how much his life sucks. And Pseudolus is like, yeah, your life sucks. Your life really sucks, dude. And that I find funny. It's a very good punch up. So at any rate, you've got this whiny son who doesn't understand the purpose of money and who is so in love that he can't tell that his girlfriend is kind of inappropriate. Here's the thing. So next up are a couple of miscellaneous stock characters. One is the bragging soldier. This guy's in the play too. Polyplagmonides, I think, is the dude's name. More about him later. And this is a soldier who, at least according to him, was in charge of every battle he ever won. He's the best warrior ever. He fought 10 men with his arm tied behind his back, and he's been to every major conflict in the last 50 years, and he never shuts up about his war stories, and he thinks that he is just the end-all be-all most brave badass dude ever. He's that guy. No, I'm not going to name names, but this is that guy. This is the action hero. This is the funny Arnold Schwarzenegger. No, I'm not going to bring The Rock into this. I'm not going to touch The Rock. I love him. At any rate, bragging soldier, he's going to show up. And then finally, we have people involved in the sex work economy. I'll talk more about them coming up, but just briefly, and this may be the thing that's like really surprising to us as modern people, because this isn't something that we see regularly in our comedy, sometimes, but not regularly, is a lot of the humor revolves around making fun of human sex traffickers, which is an interesting place to draw that line. So the pimp is the least reputable character in the play, and he kind of doesn't care that he's disreputable, which makes him very entertaining. But then there are all of these people that the pimp is trafficking that are the thing that all of the non-enslaved and enslaved characters are arguing over, like who gets to purchase them, who gets to sleep with them, and so on and so forth, a situation that the enslaved sex workers really don't have a lot of voice in. And it's another thing that is super upsetting when you sit with it and think about it for a while. But it's a major thing that gets made fun of in ancient comedy, in part because there was an awareness in the ancient world that with just a few things going wrong in your society, one war goes sideways, Rome beats Carthage, you too could end up kidnapped, trafficked, and forced to do sex work. There's a lot thinner line between people and sex work, and it's also a perfectly legal thing to do in the ancient world. Like, they're not hiding it, it's happening everywhere, and people are openly putting their money into this sub-economy too. which means that most ancient people had to deal with this constant fear that maybe someday they too would be trafficked. And it's not even if your country gets invaded. Like, if you're traveling and pirates kidnap you, you could end up being trafficked for sex labor, which was a regular way that people got into sex work in the ancient world, which meant that one of the common anxieties that Roman comedy is helping people deal with is this anxiety about what happens if I'm trafficked. Yeah. So with all that in mind, let's proceed to the play. Couple general points about Plautus's plays. We've got about 20 of them, most of them in the Ambrosian Palimpsest. He loves writing about mistaken identity. It's a perennial favorite still in comedy, where you think somebody's, say, a diplomat from Kazakhstan, but he's really Sacha Baron Cohen, say. That's something we love to run our comedy off still, and Plautus really likes it. This also makes Plautus a hard author to read sometimes because his plots are super confusing, because there's a character, but everybody thinks he's this, but he's that, but he's really that, and then this character's pretending to be this character. So just kind of get ready for this. You may want to take notes as you're reading. If you're confused, don't give up. It's okay. It's a confusing play. He really likes romantic and domestic complications. There's a slash between them because they're both of them going on at the same time. So multiple family members in love with the same person, lots of people competing to buy the same person, one family member plotting against another family member so they can get that family member's money to go buy inappropriate human traffic. That's the kind of situation Plautus is grooving off of. And these are situations that are common sources of angst in ancient Rome. We know this because they're situations that Romans are constantly passing laws about. And one of the best tip-offs that somebody in your culture has a lot of anxiety about something is it illegal? If it's illegal, probably somebody was nervous enough to pass a law about it. More about that coming up. There's a lot of deliberate deception on the part of less powerful characters, particularly enslaved characters. In fact, I can't think of a Plautus play that isn't in some part about an enslaved character manipulating their social power in order to get their way. And it's an interesting question of why are there so many plays about this in a culture where that's so scary to people? Well, that's part of it, is it's helping people bleed off their anxiety. But there's also this escape clause in Roman religion that lets Plautus write plots like this, and this is a thing called Saturnalian Reversal. We'll talk more about Saturnalia on the next slide, but just briefly, one of the things about this holiday, the Saturnalia, is that enslaved people would be like king for the week, and their enslavers would pretend to be their slaves for the week in a way that let people safely switch roles in order to dissipate some of the inherent tension of living in this kind of toxic environment. So more about that in a minute, but that's why Saturnalian Reversal comes up here. This is already a culture that has a safety valve like this, where you do, under certain circumstances, allow enslaved people to like burn off their angst a little bit so that we dissipate tension before it comes to armed rebellion and uprising. And Plautus takes that holiday atmosphere, which, if you're going to see a play, it's a holiday. It's your special day. It's time out of time. It's not the real world, it's the fake play world. And because it's just a play, you can get away with the same kind of stuff that you can when it's just a holiday. It's just a custom. So it gives people a safe space in order to imagine what would happen if. There's a lot of other boundary crossing and boundary violation issues that get put on the stage in Plautus. And these boundary violations are interesting because they show us, by their violation, where the boundaries were in normal everyday Roman society. We still do this in comedy. Comedy is a place where you can say stuff that you normally can't say, normally shouldn't say, probably because it's harmful and you shouldn't be saying it. But the idea that joking is a space where you can say ridiculous things to be funny, and they're funny because they're getting at a certain truth that's hard to deal with, so we make a joke about it that helps us to emotionally tackle the thing. That's going on in Plautus. So Plautus gives us a lot of great information about what are Romans worried about? How do Romans feel about living in their suddenly more complicated and more powerful position in the Mediterranean? And that's one of the reasons I love Plautus, is Plautus gives us a sense of how Romans are coping with this strange new political place they're finding themselves in these days. How do they cope with a society that is so gosh darn stratified and toxic? And it also helps us then go to our own world of comedy and think like, okay, what toxic dynamics is, say, The Office telling us about? How does watching The Office help us deal with the tension of being in a job we hate because we need to pay for our money stuff, because without money we're going to be homeless and die? That kind of thing is what comedy still helps us cope with. So we get to be Rome's therapists this week and listen to their concerns through their humor. In order to get away with the stuff he gets away with, Plautus constructs a fake universe that we sometimes call Plautonopolis, the Plautus city. So Plautus's plays aren't set in the city of Rome. Sometimes they're set in a fake fictional Athens or Corinth, some like Greek city over there. So it's not a Roman city, it's a Greek city. So it's okay if their slaves are cheeky because that's Greek slaves, not Roman slaves. But when we look a little bit closer, they're talking about legions. They go to the forum. They're Roman law jokes that don't make sense with Greek law. They're Roman jokes. So it's in this kind of fake Greek fantasy Rome place that's a little bit like the real world, but a funny, exaggerated version of the real world, where we go off to experience funny stuff. In the same way that the world of Family Guy is, it's sort of like middle class white America, but the dog talks and the baby's trying to kill everyone. I should probably, no, I don't need to think about my baby trying to kill me. The point is, just like modern comedy, Plautus is making this not quite real world where it's safe to laugh at stuff that ordinarily it isn't safe to laugh at, and where we can think about things with a little bit of plausible deniability. We can say like, oh no, that's not the real world, it's just comedy, it's just a joke. And this is something that we still do with comedy. Just being a joke sometimes lets us get away with stuff we shouldn't be getting away with, but it also lets us create a space where we say telling and true things that are very revealing about our attitudes. And here's an example of what this looks like in action. It's a line from the play where Simo, this is the old man character, is pretending that like he's a character in Homer. He's like, my Ulysses has seized the palladium from Pimp Citadel. This is a Trojan War joke that now this is going to be really long if I explain it. Just suffice to say that Plautus's fake world is built out of a mashup of mythological tropes and a fictionalized almost real world plus cartoonish violence, like modern comedy does, especially animated comedy. The world of The Simpsons is very close to the world of Plautus in that way. About the Saturnalia. So the Saturnalia took place from December 17th to the 23rd. It was sacred to the god Saturn, the god of the harvest, the father of Jupiter, and it was a harvest festival celebrating the winter solstice. At this festival, you would exchange small presents. You'd have big parties with your whole family where you would all wear this special, like, soft, slouchy cap. This is called the freedman's cap or the Libertas Cap. And this was a cap that you wore during Saturnalia and you gave to an enslaved person when they were attaining freedom. So when you crossed from enslaved to freed person status, you would wear this cap as a sign of your new status, and you'd also wear it at Saturnalia. So in Saturnalia, that boundary of enslaved and freed is crossed because an enslaved person would be king for the week. And this is still a part of British Christmas celebrations where you'll have a Lord of Misrule. So this Lord of Misrule got to be temporary master, where the enslavers, that person's owners, would get to jokingly like be his slave for a week, where they role reverse. But things are going to go right back to the way they were at the end of the week, so you did still have to be careful about what you did and didn't do. There were limits and rules even within this supposed reversal thing. But this was, in some ways, a guaranteed timeout that I think, and I have some evidence to back this up, allowed Roman enslavers to reconcile the cognitive dissonance that came from enslaving other human beings day to day. Like realizing that, oh, these are human beings, this could be me in another life, and I'm oppressing them, and I'm ordering them around, and beating them into submission. Like, how do I live with myself? Oh, well, I'm a nice owner because I let them have a great Saturnalia party and I gave them a new tunic, so I'm not like the other owners. I'm a good enslaver. No, you're not. But also, this is a place where we see some ritualized guilt being vented. And also it's a place that lets them think, oh, well, this isn't really so bad because look, they're having such a good time during Saturnalia week. And, we'll just all go back to it, but someday I'll free them and it'll be fine. This is a place that I go to when I'm thinking about, is it fair to get mad at ancient people for having an enslaved society? Like, a lot of people will say that, you can't put modern mores onto ancient people, that that's not fair to them. And there is a point there, to a point. But one of the ways that I've come to the conclusion that slavery and enslavement is always wrong is by taking ancient people's voices seriously when they talk about enslavement. Ancient legal theorists agree that slavery is an unnatural state, that it's not good for the owners, it's not good for the enslaved people, that it leads to more cruelty, and that ultimately everyone's goal should be working towards freedom. This isn't a modern opinion. This is an opinion that ancient people came to conclusions on. And you hear ancient people often talking about how, like, what do we do to make this more ethical? Even though it's not ethical, like, this is the system we're in, so, like, how do we cope with this? So the fact that ancient people wrestle with this, they feel bad about it, they don't like it, they can agree that it's morally suspect, that tells me that, yeah, it's probably a bad idea. And I'm also like, thank goodness I live in a society where that kind of evil in its ancient form is not normalized. However, we all do stuff that's problematic and messed up. Like, not all of my clothing comes from sources where I can say absolutely it was made without coerced labor, because that's the kind of economy we're in right now. My lifestyle is not carbon neutral. So there are things that we do that aren't right, that we recognize aren't right, but that are structurally set up to be hard not to participate in. So all of this is on my mind when I'm looking at Romans using Saturnalia as their safety valve for this persistent socioeconomic stumbling point. And I think that's what I want to say about Saturnalia. All right, so moving on.